Welcome back to the Kumeyaay channel, everybody. We are continuing the series of book reviews on a people's history of the United States. We are at chapter 17, or Does It Explode? This is about race. Certainly one of the core topics that's covered in this book quite well. As we started with chapter 9, the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, this would be the next chapter in that theme that would be solely focused on race. So we have here at the beginning, we ended last book review, chapter 16 on World War II and the conclusion. What happened after from the Roaring 20s to the 50s, this so-called period of prosperity for the 5%. Okay, memory of slavery, segregation, and lynching and humiliation was still there, so it was no surprise to the African American or Black community. There's a poem used that is actually what is the title of this chapter by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up or does it explode? In a society where these complex controls, often secret thoughts are held in art such as blues, jazz, poetry. He references the book Black Boy. I read it. It's a very good book, actually. And he uses the word, hot, coiled, and waiting for these folks. One of the things that Zinn references is lynching and police is why these mobs were kept in order, for lack of a better word, where they couldn't revolt. And so the police and these lynch mobs were used to suppress this underlying resentment for millennia or centuries, excuse me. So at this point in time, he starts to talk about the Communist Party. The Communist Party was very important for these segments of our society that were never included in any political realm. For the first time, many Blacks felt united with whites. There was a class consciousness of struggle, a class consciousness that was breaking down ethnic divisions. The Communist Party organized rent relief, organized demonstrations, and it gave Blacks hope and a path toward equality, which they never had before. For instance, W.E.B. Du Bois was connected to the Communist Party. At this point in time, he starts talking about Truman. Truman was had a hypocritical message, as we talked about last week. One of the main themes of last chapter was the hypocritical message of the United States. While we are fighting racism abroad during World War II, we're practicing racism at home. The Committee on the Civil Rights was formed at this time. Truman formed it, recommended laws against lynching, stop voting discrimination, and end racial discrimination in jobs. Surprise, surprise. Congress did not enact a legislation by the Committee on Civil Rights. What a shocker. Why were civil rights important to us? Moral reasons are obvious. Economic reasons are not so obvious. Discrimination was costly. And also, with United States had this new position in world power, but just never had before. And it basically, think of it like a magnifying glass was on the United States as we became the sole world power, which rivaled the Russian Empire at the time. So our civil rights record was now an issue in world politics. Truman issued executive order only to desegregate the military at this time. It was a really small step, drop in the bucket. Which took 10 years to desegregate the military. Truman could have went farther, and this is what will happen later, is that constitutional lawyers realized that the president had the power via executive order to enact new laws. This was something Donald Trump really used for the first time, created more executive orders in history. So at this point in time, Truman could have done that. The executive power is really, some say it's too much, where it over supersedes the Senate. So this idea of checks and balances, it's not a balanced system. The president actually has a lot more power than people realize at this point, and it wasn't really used until Donald Trump recently did it. Had a series of insane executive orders that were which never rivaled. It set a new precedent. So, anyways, my point is these constitutional lawyers realized, such as back in the 1860s and 70s with the 14th and Fifth Amendment, that new laws could have been passed. However, at this point in time, the Supreme Court was also problematic. It had defended Plessy versus Ferguson since the 1890s. Plessy versus Ferguson, just to put it um, real simply, was the separate but equal policy on the railroad. So it had this far-reaching effect in other segments of society, but it really was started at the railroad, where you could separate blacks and whites in railroad cars. So the Supreme Court defended it up until the Brown versus Board of Education struck it down in 1954. However, they did not insist on immediate change, and schools dragged their feet without a clear deadline. All this was deliberate speed. 10 years later, in 1965, after Brown versus Board, more than 75% of schools remained segregated. This sent shockwaves throughout the world. And in the early 60s and late 60s, Black people rose in rebellion all over the South, first in the early 60s, and later in the 60s, 100 cities in the North. All right, moving on. So it was all a surprise to those without deep memory of slavery, that everyday presence of humiliation registered in the poetry, the music, the occasional outburst of anger, the more frequent sullen silences. Part of that memory was of words uttered by politicians, laws passed, decisions made, which turned out to be meaningless. For such a people with such a memory and such daily recapitulation of history, revolt was always minutes away, in a timing mechanism which no one had set, but which might go off with some unpredictable set of events. So Rosa Parks was a catalyst in this event, in this moment in time. She was part of the NAACP. She starts the Montgomery bus boycott, where most African Americans walked, some carpooled. And what they did basically was they shut down the whole economy, in a way, of the transportation economy, by just not using the bus anymore. White segregationists turned to violence. King's home was bombed. Martin Luther King. A shotgun blast was used in his front against his front door, and bombs exploded in 4 Negro churches. 1954 Supreme Court outlawed segregation on local bus lines. But the Montgomery bus boycott, what it did was it set the tone for what was to come. And this mood of protest, which swept the next 10 years. The doctrine of nonviolence was enacted as a key tactic at this moment in time. So Martin Luther King, his hero was Gandhi, and he was also a minister, so he understood what nonviolence was. And Gandhi, to be honest, was I tell students, I study theology. Gandhi was one of the most Christian people that ever lived, and he was a Hindu. And the reason why I say that is because the doctrine of nonviolence, which was founded on Christ, love your neighbor, love your enemies, pray for your enemies, bless your enemies, and bless those who speak against you, and pray for those. And I forgot I know the passage. I'm just drawing a blank. Anyways, that's where it comes from, the doctrine of nonviolence. And this idea was the core of Martin Luther King. What it was very important, though, this idea of nonviolence, because, and quote, the weapon of love, compassion, and understanding for those who hate us created this new protest. And it stressed love and nonviolence powerfully, which effectively built sympathetic white and black followings. So we recently had and I'll talk about it a little bit throughout. We recently had this debate recently in 2020 riots after George Floyd. You had this idea of violence versus nonviolence. So the violence will be manifest in this particular time in the Black Panthers. The nonviolent debate will be manifest in Martin Luther King and his tactics. So they both have their strengths and weaknesses. Both are trying to accomplish the same thing, fundamental change in race relations for minorities of the United States. How we get there is still debated. That's kind of what I'm trying to say. We were having the same debate in 2020, where I think a couple of newscasters got in trouble for uh, supporting the violence this and after George Floyd. Many thought King was naive and still do, that we need nonviolence to defend themselves. Um, for example, you want to start shooting back at the KKK when they have guns. Basically, what you're going to do is give up your life. And I don't think people wanted to do that or give up your child's life. So just imagine being in that predicament. So at this point in time in 1960, we have another important moment in time. The first sit-in was at the Woolworths lunch counter in Greensboro, where it stated whites only. Now, this spread like wildfire through 15 cities and five southern states over 2 weeks. By over a year, there were 50,000 people, some white, demonstrating in over 100 cities. 3,600 were put in jail for these sit-ins. There was success by the end of the 1960s, where many lunch counters were now open to blacks. Then there were the Freedom Riders. They tried to break the pattern of segregation in interstate travel. Even though it was illegal, it wasn't enforced. Again, this idea of the separate but equal Brown versus Board, it passed in 1954, but it wasn't being enforced, especially in the South. So that's why they did these the Freedom Riders. JFK at this time was too concerned with the support for the Southern Democratic Party to really care. The bus was set afire, riders beaten, police did not interfere. The federal government stood by and did nothing. The FBI stood by and took notes, and did nothing. And at this point in time, you have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, again, inspired by the doctrine of nonviolence. Very important to emphasize that idea. So if you're going to remember one thing, I really want you to remember this idea, the doctrine of nonviolence, where it came from, how it was used, and the debate between the violence of using violence. It's really core to this chapter, and I don't think he emphasizes it enough. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he doesn't care to, but I do personally. So organize another freedom ride. The SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organized another freedom ride that earns global attention from Nashville to Birmingham. Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General at the time, allowed the Mississippi police force to arrest for their protection. Air quotes. Albany, Georgia, another mass demonstration. Birmingham, another Albany in Georgia, 61, 62 mass demonstrations took place. Birmingham in 1963, thousands went to protest where they were clubbed, set dogs on them. They were blasted by fire hoses and tear gas. This is one of those moments in Birmingham where it's one of those moments in history where it's if you watch anything on this moment in history, you'll see them, this moment in time where they're blasting them with fire hoses. It's had a lot of media coverage, actually, that one in particular. All over the South, the SNCC organized protests, registered people to vote, and built up courage against violence. Okay. In 1964, the summer of 1964, SNCC and other civil rights groups worked together in Mississippi. People asked to join from all across the nation. They wanted to bring attention to the FBI and federal government of the inaction of the FBI and the federal government, and they rented a theater at the White House. They sent busloads of Black Mississippians to testify publicly. They sent constitutional lawyers to testify the national government had the legal power to give protection against such violence, but did not. The transcript was sent to President Johnson and Attorney General Bobby Kennedy. During the Mississippi summer, there was no response. 12 days later, 5 were jailed, tortured, then shot. This brought to light the refusal of the national government under every president since Johnson to George Washington. It did not defend Blacks against violence. Okay, and so we have here the inclusion of African Americans into the political system as a result. That was probably one of the main results of this whole period in time, according to Zinn. That's problematic, and we'll cover that in a moment. So there were civil rights laws passed in 57, 60, and 64. They promised voting, employment equality, but these were poorly enforced. So the voting rights law was 1965, President Johnson. This ensured on-the-spot federal protection in the South. So by 1968 in the South, for example, there were 3 million Southern Blacks registered, 60% of those eligible, which was the same as white voters. The federal government was trying without making fundamental change. So let me say it again. The federal government was trying without making fundamental changes to control an explosive situation, to channel anger into the traditional cooling mechanism of the ballot box, the polite petition, the officially endorsed quiet gathering. So what he is saying is the voting, as we were channeling our grievances to the ballot box, where the government can now control it and make just enough change, but not fundamental change, to suppress the revolt. That's an ongoing theme throughout the chapter, and which is why people argue you have to do something else, like riot or, and this isn't me, of course. This is the debate. Through violent means or non-violent means, just civil disobedience. So that's the debate. That continues till today. How do you really change? And many would argue it's not through the ballot box. I would say both sides of that debate would argue you need something else, some type of civil disobedience. March planned 1963. So this was the famous "I Have a Dream" march in 1963. This failed to solve the race problem. It was embraced by John F. Kennedy. So John Lewis, who just passed recently, was there. He wanted stronger rhetoric, and he was outraged because what the government did was they censored their speeches, and they took the anger out that many Blacks felt at the time. So although the "I Have a Dream" speech and those that also gave speeches were very powerful and moving, they were censored and basically lacked a lot of the sentiment that was going on at the time. 18 days later was the Birmingham church bombing, killing 4 girls attending Sunday school. Malcolm X was probably closer to the national consensus at this moment in time, so he critiques the March on Washington. So he quotes, and I quote, "They joined it, became part of it, took it over. It became a picnic. They told those Negroes what time to hit town, what speech they could make. and what speech they couldn't make. Then they told them to get out of town by sundown. Nothing really changed as a result of this. Many were not brought into the democratic process. Blacks were still unemployed 2 times more than whites, and half of the black population lived below the poverty line. So, what was the problem? The Civil Rights Bill focused on voting. Here's the problem: racism and poverty cannot be addressed just by voting. That's the answer to the problem. You have to do something else. The voting, the political process is not sufficient to address racism and poverty. In 1965, the August Watts riots were the most violent outbreak since um, since World War II. So the Watts riots of 65 were what was kind of going to happen again in the Rodney King riots of April 1992, when 4 officers were acquitted for beating Rodney King in 1991. And these riots again would happen 30 years later with George Floyd in 2020. But you have to kind of draw it all the way back to these Watts riots in 1965, in the August of 1965. And this was just as the Voting Rights Act was signed. Again, in 66, there's riots in the summer of 66 in Chicago. 3 blacks were killed. In Cleveland in 66, 4 blacks were killed in a riot there. And the problem was this, is that the nonviolent strategy did not work in the ghettos. So, and this is Zinn, of course. This isn't my thoughts, but maybe there's some truth to it. I don't know. The nonviolent strategy did not work in the ghettos. And here's why. So the doctrine of nonviolence was effective in the South because it could be used to appeal to national opinion against segregation in the South. But the problem really was poverty, not segregation. So you had to do something else. And so the changing demographics. So one thing to mention, in 1940 to 1970, 4 million blacks moved from the country to the city. And also there was a great exodus to the north. So by 1965, 50% of all blacks lived in the north and 80% lived in the cities. So there was changing demographics, which certainly is important to remember when you're talking about this stuff. In 1967, the Black Ghetto Riots were the greatest urban riots of American history in 1967. So intense revolt was happening at the system that was, in many ways, not working for the vast majority of Black people. So the National Advisory Committee on Urban Disorders, so a committee was formed to create a report on why things were happening and maybe how to stop them. That's why the government does these committees and reports. It's like, okay, what's going on? What can we do for it to change so we don't have to deal with this again? The report basically said there were 8 major outbreaks, 33 serious but not major, and 123 minor disorders. 83 died of gunfire, mostly in Newark and Detroit. According to the report, mostly Black civilians were killed. The report stated the typical rioter was a young high school dropout, better educated than non-rioting neighbor, underemployed or menial job, proud of his race, frustrated at the political system. The report blamed white racism, explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II. Pervasive quote, here's another quote from the book: pervasive discrimination and segregation in employment, education, and housing. Let me say that again. Pervasive discrimination and segregation in employment, education, and housing. Growing concentrations of impoverished Negroes, particularly young, in which self-esteem and enhanced racial pride are replacing apathy, submission, and submission to the system. This was part of the report. But the commission report itself was a standard device of the system when facing rebellion. You set up an investigation committee, issue a report. The words of the report, however strong, will have a soothing effect. So again, the system itself has these safeguards. This is kind of what Zinn would say about in general overall. So the political system, these type of committees and reports, you get together, you talk about things, you act like you're going to do something, and then yeah, you kind of don't. you know, this happened in 2008 after the financial crisis. We had the Dodd-Frank report, where we started realizing that we needed to regulate the financial markets and system. And guess what? We didn't do half of them, or even a quarter, or a fraction of them. And this is what happens over and over again with these reports and committees: is that you get together, you talk about the problem, you find a solution, and you end up maybe doing a fraction of it. And so what happens is these reports and these commissions are part of the problem. You sit around and talk. Black Power was a rejection of this paternalism. Malcolm X spokesman, Malcolm X was more influential after his death. He represents the kind of other spectrum of Martin Luther King. So you have Martin Luther King over here and Malcolm X over here, and the Black Panthers. So you have these kind of different ways of getting to where you want to go, but they all want the same thing. But how do we get there? The Black Panthers, blacks must defend themselves. This is what the Black Panthers believed. Blacks must defend themselves. They must police the police. It's kind of what we're going through right now with the defund police mantra. Many new heroes arise, like Huey Newton, which replaced King as an inspiration for a better strategy. King, at this moment in time, speaks out against Vietnam. You can never touch the golden calf of capitalism. And what he did was he connected the war and poverty. So he states, we are spending all of this money for death and destruction, and not nearly enough money for life and constructive development. And I believe we're doing this today as well. We're spending half of our congressional military budget on military military on the military, and our schools, our infrastructure, everything is going to hell. So this is something King realized at this point in time. Instead of spending all this money on military and destruction, let's spend it on construction. Let's spend it on addressing poverty. And what happened was, when he did this, now he became a chief target of the FBI. They tapped his phone. They sent fake letters. They blackmailed him. They threatened him. They suggested he kill himself. Memos discussed finding another replacement for the leader, just like they've been doing in Latin America. They were now trying to find someone who could replace King, who wouldn't be such a threat to the foundation of the establishment. The report stated the FBI tried to destroy Dr. Martin Luther King. An FBI report stated. So, and here's another quote from Zinn. King was turning his attention to troublesome questions. He planned a poor people's encampment on Washington, this time without the paternal approval of the president. And he went to Memphis, Tennessee to support a strike of garbage workers in that city. There, standing on a balcony, King was shot. So he was really, right before his passing, he was planning on addressing poverty with political action. So the poor people encampment was broken up by the police. And this is similar to the bonus army of World War I in 1932, where they were dispersed. He draws that connection. Urban outbreaks happen all over the country. Courts will not protect blacks against violence and injustice. Okay. So at this part of the book, I recommend a movie, Judas and the Black Messiah, if you haven't seen it. It's basically telling you what happened at this moment in time, where the FBI kills the leader of the Black Panthers, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. So In 1964, Chicago police fire 100 rounds. And so there was an FBI informant, William O'Neill, who wrote a sketch of the floor plan, and they knew where Fred Hampton slept. And this was a part of a larger, in a way, conspiracy that the FBI was doing since 1956. Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI concluded a massive counterintelligence program known as CONTELPRO that took 275 actions against Black groups. Was their fear that Blacks would turn their attention from the controllable field of voting to the more dangerous arena of wealth and poverty, of class conflict. All right. So, one more chapter of notes. So, Zinn argues focusing on poverty, not civil rights, was more dangerous. Why? Because it had the possibility of uniting Blacks and whites on the issue of class exploitation. Philip Randolph at AFL and CIO convention stated, "The Negro has taken to the streets, so will the unemployed of all races." Okay, so quotes. Here's a quote for you. "The system was working hard by the late 60s and early 70s to contain the frightening explosiveness of Black upsurge. Blacks were voting in larger numbers in the South." So you do have a lot more Blacks entering the political field as mayors, congressmen, senators, state representatives. For example, you have by 1977, you have 2,000 Blacks holding office in 11 southern states. You have 2 congressmen, 11 senators, 95 state representatives, 76 mayors, 823 city council members, 508 school board members. However, Blacks were 20%. Now, here's something very important when you're realizing the significance of these numbers. It's how many people there are, and then how many people there are representing them. So you have at this point 1/5 or 20% of the South population is Black, with only 3%, less than 3% of elected representatives who are of Black descent. Now that's important because that means your government doesn't reflect you. Rights retain economic power, which control politics. So that's very important to understand when you're trying to realize how politics works, if it's working for you, who is it working for? And if whites are controlling the economic power, they're controlling the political power. So you don't have real representation in politics if you don't have economic representation or power, because they're correlate. They're a correlation. So at this point in time, 1977, socioeconomics are very important to mention. Unemployment for Black youth was approximately 35%. Um, Blacks were 2 times more likely to get diabetes, 7 times more likely to die from homicide, violence from poverty, and despair of the ghetto. Class consciousness. So one of the things that Zinn really he beats like a dead horse in his book was this idea of class consciousness, which again is very Marxian. And what he talked about was that desegregation, and this is pretty profound. This is stuff that there's a lot of stuff that I think he came up over the years. I think he was a professor for many years, and I think he knew political science and history. But this is really interesting what he says. So he says desegregation compromised class consciousness. Why? What he states is, and I think this is what's happening, continues to happen, is that you have everyone at the bottom fighting over these scarce resources. So you have Blacks and whites fighting over scarcity of housing, jobs, and schools. And also these folks were overcrowded, which you can imagine that would create racial tension as well. And I think this is similar to today, where you have the poor and middle class whites who are xenophobic against immigrants, in particularly Mexican immigrants and Latino immigrants and Asian immigrants, because they're fighting over what I call, maybe it's pejorative or not proper to say, but the scraps. As the 1% are taking 40% of all our wealth, they're allowing they're letting everyone at the bottom fight for the scraps and turning on each other. That's just how I think of it in my head. There's probably a better way to say that. Um, in Boston, the busing of black children. So here's an example of what we just talked about. In Boston, the busing of black children to white schools and whites to black schools set off a wave of white neighborhood violence. The use of busing to integrate schools, sponsored by the government and the courts in response to the black movement, was an ingenious concession to protest. It had the effect of pushing poor whites and poor blacks into competition for the miserable, inadequate schools that the system provided for the poor. And finally, would a new black movement go beyond the limits of the civil rights? So this is what he kind of ends on, saying like, what's to come? So that kind of, we know what that accomplished. It didn't accomplish very much at all, really. So what he ends on is this: would a new black movement go beyond the limits of the civil rights actions of the 60s and 70s, beyond the spontaneous urban riots of the 70s, beyond separatism to a coalition of white and black and a historic new alliance? Now, maybe 2020 is that. I don't know. There is no way of knowing this. As Langston Hughes said, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up or does it explode? All right, so that's a very well written, well done chapter. We will continue our series next week with Vietnam, or actually in a couple days, excuse me, with the chapter on Vietnam. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in a moment. Bye.